Signifying Something with Steve Flato.
My name is Steve Flato, and this is Signifying Something. Very happy to bring you our first episode, and very happy to share with you our guest, Lea Bertucci, and her composition, Oracle Quartet version. So, in this podcast, we will be centering our conversation around one specific piece, and seeing where the conversation takes us from that initial point. It is a learning process for me because I get so much talking to these musicians about their works. I started with my friends, and I realized that this would be a great thing to help give context for experimental music. We'll get to know the insides of these compositions and how they work and the inspiration for them and the creative process. Anyway, this is Lea Bertucci on Signifying Something. Hope you guys enjoy. I noticed that Oracle, which is the piece that we're going to play today, has a, in parentheses, it says quartet version. Can you tell us what the distinction is between Oracle and the quartet version?
Oracle proper is a piece that I am working on for a 20-voice children's choir and surround sound. It's a piece that I wrote when I was at a residency this past year at the MacDowell Colony in New Hampshire, and I spent a month alone in a cabin in the woods writing this crazy, very complicated piece for, 20 voices. And at the end of that, I had a little bit of time left over, so I started this other piece for 3 voices, tuning forks, and tape, just as a way to, realize a smaller scale piece before I started to go into production for the choir piece. So it's the first time I've ever written for voice, so I was kind of getting used to that instrument, which is, a whole world of constraints.
What do you mean by the constraints? I mean, obviously you're working with the human breath, and I feel like from what I've heard of your work, that seems to be a big theme for you.
Yeah, definitely. The first ensemble piece that I wrote was in 2012, and it was called Respire, and it was kind of a meditation on the act of breathing and sonifying that structure.
Do you take any influence from the French spectralists like Gerard Grissy? Or
Yeah, definitely. I actually, I do love a lot of spectral music. I love Chelsea, Grissy, all those folks for sure. I think I'm more influenced by the post-spectralists, like Katia Sariaho is one of my favorite composers. She's really masterful orchestrator. I got to see her piece at the Met earlier this year, and it was just such a knockout. The whole thing was just really incredible, and I've always really admired her approach to timbre and the way that she integrates electronics into her instrument-based works.
I know that that's a big thing for you too. There's a lot of pieces for traditional instruments and tape as well. I was just kind of thinking about how you go and approach the tape portion of these pieces. What technically are you doing, first of all?
With my work for tape, I use a variety of formats. I use microcassette, little throwaway kind of dictaphone things. I use regular cassettes, and I use 1/4-inch reel-to-reel. It kind of depends on the nature of the sound that I'm recording. Usually it's a mixture of instruments or kind of more field recordings, manipulated objects, stuff like that. I would say that the reason that I use tape, I've always felt that tape gives a certain kind of atmospheric texture to the sound. I actually really like using digital collage with tape, having the two juxtaposed together, because the two qualities of the sounds can really, do a lot for each other when used together. In terms of like performance, I really like using tape because you can manipulate the tape machines as though they were instruments. They are instruments. In terms of messing with the tape speed, and I just find it a very magical kind of process, recording something to tape and then listening to it at different speeds and doing, cut up collages on tape. It's like a really fun process of discovery where you think a sound, and then if you engage in this creative act of recording and overdubbing and re-recording and slowing it down and speeding it up, it turns out that there's a lot of other things going on with the sound that you hadn't heard before. So it's just a nice way to kind of digest something sonically.
Relating to Oracle Quartet version, what approach did you take to the tape music specifically in that piece?
Well, the piece starts out with just the voices and the tuning forks. So it starts in a pretty acoustic way. And then the tapes kind of pulse in. I was thinking they start with like a very low sound. So it was actually kind of like a spectral approach because the human voice can only go so low. And I'm a big fan of like very, rich, robust, low frequencies. Using some tape there was a way to kind of like flesh out the, spectrum of the sound.
As you can see, we've got some snippets of the score in our notes here, which I suggest you guys take a look at while the piece is playing. But let's take a listen to Oracle Quartet version.
Taking
Okay, Lea, so that was just a wonderful piece. I love the development of it, and there's some really remarkable things happening in the score. You've got these wild colors kind of happening, and I could sort of see what it's doing for the tuning forks. It's kind of measuring their decay.
That's exactly right.
The thing is that I'm wondering what they signify in the voice and in the tape portion.
Yeah, so it's just like using the colors is just kind of a practical thing so that the singers can like see where they are better based on the colors.
And in the tape part as well.
Oh yeah, the tape part, that was, I have to say, like, this score is actually not my most meticulously arranged one.
Part of the charm of it, it looks so like kind of visceral, especially in the tape part.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the notation for the tape, I mean, you know, it's something that is basically just for me to remember, because this piece isn't really meant to be played by anyone except for me, just by virtue of the nature of the tape. I would say that, you know, the tape parts are notated so that you can understand something about the density of the sound and how it should kind of like develop. But yeah, I mean, completely graphic, completely structural.
It's really great to look at while listening to it, because you see these little indications, like as far as the micro cassette coming in, and you see this wonderful array of colors, and it really does feel like what you're hearing. Can you tell us some of the names? Like, I see there's muted harmonics, there's birds with crinkling. Are these just kind of notes to you to indicate which tape you're going to use?
Yeah, they're totally for myself. You know, it's interesting because traditionally, you know, you would make a score so that people in the future would be able to play your music. But here, I mean, I think that the circumstances are a little bit different. It's just kind of a reminder to me what the different tapes that I use are. I have pet names for, you know, all the tapes that I record. Some of them are kind of funny, and some of them
Absolutely.
are, you know, just what it is, you know, a train squeal, or walking through a forest, or fire, or, you know, any of the above.
Have you ever used the software Argentist Lyre by any chance?
No, I don't think so.
What it does is it outputs these random names, and they're so memorable. Like, I got one named Scandalous, Scrubby, Scruffy. And I always remember what that sound is.
Yeah. It's like the artist statement generator.
Yeah, exactly. We will definitely link to that in our notes for sure, because it's pretty funny.
It's pretty good.
So one other theme I noticed in your work is these beating patterns with notes, sustained notes usually, and you're sort of like playing with the harmonic series. And I imagine that's some sort of connection to the physical space aspect in your work. Can you go on about some of these beating patterns and why you use them?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that there is, you know, with microtonality, there's something extremely striking about it, because it really manipulates the subjective perspective of the listener, meaning, you know, the intraaural locutions and the kind of psychoacoustic phenomena that can occur when, you know, two notes beat against each other. I'm really interested in the kind of phenomena of sound. I think it's very, very mystical stuff. I think that beyond the physicality of it, it also, using microtonal harmony, has a particular type of emotional resonance. And I think that it has the ability to describe states that are pretty indescribable if you cling to Western tonality. It's something that has always been kind of an interest to me, is trying to describe emotional states that are very subtle or very or moving, you know, like emotional states that change quickly over time. And I feel that like the beating can be a really great metaphor for that change. It's also a very natural thing, you know, it's something that is ultimately physics. I think that that's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. The beating provides such tension, or, you know, it could actually go towards just this pure consonance as well. Just for our listeners, something that I'm going to get into is there's a distinction between microtonality and just intonation. And what I'd like to talk to Lea about is whether she has used just intonation specifically in her work. What just intonation is it's these pure ratios, whereas microtonality is a larger category and could include, you know, say quarter tone scale, which is just double the notes of the 12-note equal scale that we have. So Lea, have you explored specifically just intonation, or are you kind of more free with your approach to microtonality?
I would say that I use both microtonal and just intonation techniques, as well as, you know, equal temperament. I kind of use it all, and I use it in an intuitive way, and I never hold myself to one rule. I kind of just do what sounds good. I'm very kind of like anti-institutional in the way that I think about music. Whenever a process becomes very rule-based or strict or rote, it kind of becomes less interesting to me.
Kind of kills it.
Yeah, I mean, I just feel very confident in my own intuition about things, and that's what I tend to choose. I've definitely experimented and thought a lot about Pythagorean tuning, and, you know, I have like a lap steel guitar that I take out every so often, which is very fun to mess around in just intonation with. So it just depends on the instrumentation, and it depends on the content of the work, but I don't hold myself hard and fast to any system in particular.
That's an interesting approach, and I actually take a similar approach myself. I play a just intonation guitar, and I kind of was almost paralyzed by the fact that I might be out of tune, or the fact that I'd exit this system in some way and kind of, you know, ruin the process or concept of it. And then kind of once I got over that and said, okay, I could bend notes and I could go into whatever I want, it kind of freed me up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I grew up playing jazz and classical music, and I have a lot of training in those genres. But I think that the reason that, you know, I spent a while not playing music, and I have a degree in photography. I think the thing that turned me off about a lot of music was how institutional it became, and how ultimately, to me, music is just kind of like a expression of freedom or a movement towards freedom. I think any time that something becomes too rule-based, it just, even spectralist approach, you know, it can really just actually like sap the creativity of the work.
I think because it is sort of making you, for me, it, again, that word paralyze, like it kind of creates this fear.
Yeah, like, are you good enough? Are you fucking it up? Or, you know, not?
Yeah.
And like that whole kind of evaluation of whether you're good at something or like how good of a robot you are, you know, is really boring to me. And I think that's a very like 20th century idea, and it's completely uninteresting to me.
I mean, when Schoenberg was making his serialist works and like kind of coming up with that idea, he was making the rules and he wasn't institutionalized with those rules yet. So I imagine there was a huge amount of freedom even in making that system. But once it kind of became something you could teach in a course, I imagine that it again, that word paralyzing, like it just sort of makes you scared to break the rules.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you look at how the way that jazz has become institutionalized, you know, the kind of like Juilliard school of jazz, I think is so perverse and so against what the nature of jazz really was ever meant to be. Yeah, I find it a little bit disturbing when things like that occur. But it's funny that you bring up Schoenberg, because do you know that Schoenberg coined the term new music?
Did he?
Yeah.
No.
He was the first, he used that to describe his music at the time, because, he didn't want to call it classical music. He didn't want to call it serial music. He just wanted to call it new music because it was so groundbreaking. The whole term new music nowadays describes a form of music that is so not... I think it's very much against what Schoenberg was really going for, because I think a lot of it just actually doesn't push any boundaries. I mean, really, like, if you listen to Schoenberg even now, it sounds totally dissonant. Like, it still sounds really hard to... It's very hard to deal with aesthetically. Yeah, and I feel like a lot of, like, people who went to these music schools, are playing, like, indie classical music and calling it new music. And I think that is so wrong, and I think that Schoenberg would probably be turning in his grave if he could hear what was going on today under the use of this term, There's nothing new about it. I mean, there's nothing avant-garde about a lot of that music.
There's this openness to the idea of Schoenberg's new music as you were describing it. And I feel like just because it's new happening now doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually new music that is, kind of...
Yeah.
I mean, you can go back to even somebody like Bach, where you can say that he's been put in a system. You can write a clone Bach piece by the rules, but he was making that language, and that's truly, I feel experimental or avant-garde, just kind of coming up with this new idea and making the rules as you go.
Yeah, totally. It's creating music that people have never heard before. So it's quite literally is new music. But I think the idea behind what Schoenberg was going for was to push ahead against or get beyond the old traditions and create a new language that is, more original than what came before.
Absolutely. I feel like he was in many ways an early experimental music composer. I mean, he was just creating a new language, and you could kind of say that about so many other things, like even, again, that Bach example, like you could say he was an experimentalist in a lot of ways. So I feel like that idea and that tradition has been alive for a long time, although it's only been called experimental music less than a century, since John Cage. I guess moving on, I'd like to discuss the relationship between... There's a piece on Access Atlas, which is a previous work of yours, called Cepheid.
Yeah, it's a star cluster.
And then there's Cepheid variations on your new NNA tape, All That Is Solid Melts Into Air. Is there some sort of relationship, or... Yeah,
so I developed those two pieces at the same time, and they were premiered together as, one kind of concert-length thing. The tape piece was the first one, and then the variations is the one with the strings. Basically, like, the idea behind those two pieces was to explore resonance. And, I developed them when I was an artist in residence at Issue Project Room, so I was in that space at 22 Borum Place, which is this really beautiful building by the architects McKim, Mead, and White, that is, made of marble and very resonant and very echoey. I'm actually about to go there tomorrow and record some new music. So yeah, I was exploring ideas of resonance and, the use of harmonics. In the tape Cepheid piece, a lot of the source material is prepared piano, where I'm just like using the soundboard, recording inside the piano. So the way that the strings resonate, holding down the sustain pedal the whole time. I guess, like, I sort of took a similar approach with the way that I wrote for the strings, using a lot of artificial harmonics. And also, I mean, in that one, I definitely did a lot of just intonation, although, it kind of goes in and out from just.
And then the other piece on the on All That Is Solid Melts Into Air is called Double Bass Crossfade. And the concept of this, there's actually a little video online. I think it's on Vimeo, and you can look it up.
Oh, you found that? Oh, good.
I did, yeah. So this piece involves a 10-channel sound system, and there's two double bassists moving across the room. And I guess, from my understanding, these bassists' output is kind of, depending on where they are, it maps itself to the 10-channel sound system. What was the score like to this piece? And also, how did you manage to mix down this 10-channel piece into a stereo field for the tape?
So the piece was premiered at this event that I curated in 2015 called Auditorium, where we installed a 10-channel sound system at this venue in New York called the Knockdown Center, which is this massive former warehouse. Big open floor plan, very resonant space. So yeah, we just kind of like put speakers all over the place in a sort of eccentric surround sound kind of configuration. And the piece is for two double bassists who are both wirelessly mic'd. They start at opposite ends of the space and then over the course of 45 minutes move towards each other. As they move towards each other, basically like their sounds are distributed to whichever speakers they're in closest proximity to. And because they're moving across the space in a certain way, just in one, straight line, they kind of like create a wake of sound as they pass through the space. As they meet in the center and come very close to each other, all the speakers are activated at that point. The score basically looks like an architectural floor plan. It looks like an architectural floor plan with this like weird kind of form that is an overlay kind of thing. And so it was verbal instructions. There's no notation. I told the bassists to, when they're across the room from each other, start playing at the very highest range of their instruments, sustained tones, lots of texture, starting with harmonics. And then as they move across the space, play down the range of their instruments until when they meet, be at the very lowest range and playing, very more aggressively and, big double stops on the lowest end of their instruments. And then as they pass each other and return to each other's starting positions, going back up the instrument, playing to its highest range. So it's basically like a giant musical palindrome where they start where they finish, or they finish where they start.
How did you approach, going back to this, how did you approach putting this into a stereo version that represented the piece? Did you approach it like some sort of field recording with, I'm just kind of curious how that worked.
Yeah, so the way that we documented the performance was, I think we had two stereo pairs of microphones throughout the space that were just kind of capturing the room sound. And then we were taking a multi-channel, like a multi-track mix off of the board. I was live mixing the piece as it happened. So I was controlling, what sound went to what speaker. So then after that, I kind of, for a while, because it was, so spatially dependent, I kind of thought that I shouldn't release it as, a conventional recording. But then I thought about it and I actually realized that because of the structure of the piece and because there's two bassists, that it actually kind of lends itself really well to the stereo field. So I ended up mixing it in a way where the crossfade kind of, I don't know how apparent that is, but, so like bassist A starts in speaker on the left side and then moves to the right side over the course of the mix.
Going back to the question of your tape works, you mentioned that you have some sort of computer assistance sometimes or digital manipulation. How do you approach that? What do you decide will be manipulated live on cassette or tape? And what do you decide will be manipulated on the computer? And how do you approach the manipulation on the computer as well?
It really depends on the sound. I never perform with, or I rarely perform with a computer. I would say that the the things that I'm most likely to use digital processing for are, I have a really nice Eventide reverb plugin. I have this like cool stereo delay thing that I use sometimes. But mostly it's for like compression and EQ, because I don't have like a really fancy analog mixing console. And so I can do like really, specific EQ cuts using the computer. But generally, most of the manipulation is the tape. And most of it is speed manipulation and like looping and layering.
That was my next question. Yeah, like what you're physically doing to the tape. I can imagine on the reel-to-reel, because you have so much more control over the tape because it's, pretty big compared to the other ones. But so you've got, I imagine, variable speed cassette players.
Yeah, I have this little Marantz PD. Oh God, I forget what the model number is, but it's a really great Marantz tape machine that has it has both pitch correction and 2 speeds, so I can do a lot of like very specific manipulation of the tape. My reel-to-reel is like a Philips, an old Philips from the 80s. It has 3 speeds. It's a pretty noisy machine though, so it's not like a very clean sound, but the way that I can mess with the speeds is really nice. I can create these beautiful glissandi using that machine.
I wanted to ask you about Dense Mesh. Are you still participating in that series or running that series rather?
I am, but at a much more scaled back capacity than originally. I started the series in 2012, and it was just, house shows out of my loft when I was living in Bushwick. And it was a really special vibe, and I always made a big meal, and it kind of, it was just like a good vibe. It was a good community kind of event where everyone was in a good mood and having fun. I still do it sometimes at this place called the Sunview Luncheonette. I'll only do it like maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And the space is in Greenpoint, and it's a kind of semi-public venue that used to be an old diner and is completely unrenovated. So it's like 60s diner. Which
nice.
Yeah, it's a really fun space. So yeah, I do it there sometimes.
Excellent. So where was the old building? Because I know that we shared a bill at one point. You and Sandy Gordon played. Mm-hmm. And oh my God, it was so great. It really knocked me out. And I think I played just the worst set that night. So I'm sure you don't remember.
When was this though?
That's the problem. I don't remember if it was Dense Mesh and it was your...
I think that might have been at Sandy's old loft.
I think that was it.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that was it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. God, that was a while ago.
It was a long time ago. That was right before I moved to California to San Diego. And I think Bob Bellery played also.
Right,
and that was my first time seeing him. That was a really cool show. Yeah, you guys absolutely knocked me out that night. It was just like, because I had never heard either of you before. And Sandy, I think, was on Vibes.
She had a vibraphone. I think she still has it, but she doesn't really play it that often. I think she's mostly been doing kind of like small percussion instruments.
Yeah, that was a great duo. Do you guys have any plans to continue that duo, or have you played since?
We played for a while. We're not really actively collaborating at the moment. I've just been kind of like focusing on solo work, and I've been doing more like writing for other instruments, and I've been doing a lot of sound design for theater and choreography. So I've kind of been like super busy with those kinds of projects. So I haven't been able to collaborate like in like a jammy way with other people so much lately. I'm sure I'll get back into it at some point.
Well, I wanted to ask you one last question, and I feel like this is something that I have always had a problem with. But how do you know when something that you're working on, obviously not an improvisation, but a composition, how do you know when it's done?
That's a really good question. So usually what I'll do is like, I'll work on something and I'll have my head like way deep in it for a while. I basically do that until I can't hear the piece anymore. I'm listening so intently that I can't even hear it, and then I know that I need to step away. And at that point, I usually take a few days and clear my ears and, just kind of reset a little bit. I'll listen to it again without looking at the waveform.
That's so important too. Yeah, absolutely. Super important to do that.
It's actually one of the things about SoundCloud that bothers me.
Oh, me too. Yeah, because you could see something coming.
Yeah, it's like a visual thing rather than an auditory thing. But yeah, so I listen to it without looking at the waveform. And if there's something that I feel uncomfortable about, I know it immediately. And then I'll try to go back in and fix whatever part that is that I feel like maybe isn't working. And then I'll kind of repeat the process where I listen to it a lot until I can't hear it anymore. And then I step away. And then once I come back and I don't feel like I have anything else to fix, then I kind of know it's done.
That's great. That's actually super helpful to me because I don't know, it's just been a constant problem for me where I'll just keep overworking things. But you're right. I think the stepping away is really key. Because if your head's too in it, then it's just almost impossible. Like you said, you can't really hear it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And, you know, I think it's really good to approach something with a fresh perspective. And I don't know, I just know that I have a pretty good intuitive sense about things. So I know immediately, and I'm also like fairly critical about, you know, what I do. So I know pretty quickly if something is wrong. You know, also another good thing to do that I do sometimes is like I'll listen to something in the presence of a friend.
Yes, and you could feel their energy and feel how they listen to it, right?
Yeah, and even if they don't like give me any feedback, if I feel uncomfortable about something, not even based on anything that they're doing, then I know that that's something that I have to revisit.
Totally. It's important to get that music into other people's ears. I feel like I could hear how they're listening sometimes. You're right. Even if they don't give any feedback, you could kind of just feel the energy and feel whether something's wrong or not.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, or just like you kind of like get a more honest picture about how you feel about it, you know, based on if you feel uncomfortable, you know, listening to a certain thing in the presence of somebody else. So that kind of like heightens your critical faculties a little bit.
Now, how do you approach that when you can't actually hear the work, when you're doing a scored work?
Well, you know, the process that I use, so I wrote this piece for children's choir, for 20-voice children's choir and surround sound.
Original Oracle, correct?
Yeah, the Oracle proper, which is going to premiere in June.
And where is that going to premiere?
That's going to premiere at Madison Square Park, an outdoor space in Manhattan. Yeah, it should be pretty interesting. What I did was, so the piece is a lot of like sustained notes and microtonal stuff and like glissandi, a lot of like weird moving masses of sound. What I did for that, I really like don't know how to write for voice. I didn't study composition. And so I just kind of took, again, an intuitive approach where I just made a bunch of samples of my voice singing glissandi from various pitches on the piano. And then, you know, I made this like ridiculous massive sample library. And then I just kind of created a digital collage in Live. And then I notated that collage.
That's really wonderful approach. Like, I have sort of the same thing going on where I have to hear it and feel it. I can't just think about it and put it on paper. So I had to do an organ piece for the Balboa Park organ, the spreckled organ here in San Diego.
Yeah, I listened to it. It was really nice.
Oh, thank you very much, Lea. There was just this thing where I couldn't start writing until I heard it. So I found this organ emulator with stops and all that, cool. And that was the only way I was able to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have perfect pitch, you know, and I'm not a person that can just like hear intervals in my mind, and so yeah, like I really have to hear it. So, and MIDI is always problematic.
Oh yeah, unless you get good sample libraries like in Contact or something like that.
There are some good sample libraries out there, but also like because I had really specific techniques that I was using. These weird glissandi, I just decided to like make my own sample library. So the initial collage of Oracle, the choir piece, is just like my voice, which is kind of crazy because I'm not a trained vocalist. Yeah, so I mean, that was like the process basically.
And I imagine that you did a similar thing for the quartet version?
Yeah, totally. I used that sample library again to create a basic sketch, which then I notated.
That is super helpful to me personally, I gotta say. Well, Lea, thank you so much for joining us on the program. And let's see, you've got your NNA tape coming out, All That Is Solid Melts Into Air, and that should be out.
The release date is March 24th.
And you've got a tour coming up? You want to share the tour dates with us?
Yeah, sure. Let's see. I will be heading out the first week of April. I'll be doing Philly, Pittsburgh, a bunch of shows in Ohio, Cleveland, Columbus, Oberlin, and Buffalo. And then the next month, I'll be playing in Burlington, Vermont, and Montreal. 2 kind of like mini tours.
Excellent. And what website can we reach you at?
Sure. My website is brokendiorama.com or my SoundCloud.
Excellent. And it's an excellent SoundCloud. There's a great sampling of Lea's work there. Well, Lea, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you could join us again when you're putting out your next album, and thanks a lot.
Yeah, totally. Very excited to be featured on the initial cast here.
Well, that's all we've got for today. I hope you enjoyed Lea Bertucci. You can visit us on the web at signifying-something.com. Check us out on Bandcamp, signifyingsomething.bandcamp.com, where you could download lossless copies of all these pieces and interviews. Also, please don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes. Subscribe and rate us because the ratings help. They push us up the charts, more people hear, and the program can continue. We've also got a support page where you could give us money. It's patreon.com/signifying something. That's patreon.com/signifying something. Thanks again to Lea Bertucci for being on this initial episode, and we will have more for you soon.